Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. There are a ton of extraordinarily powerful characters in Bleach, and crucially, power in Bleach is often depicted in a variety of ways. Whether that power is found simply in bankai, or in the gulf between two characters on the battlefield, in secret second forms, or boundless intelligence, there are innumerable ways to calculate and quantify power throughout the series, and this only becomes more pronounced the deeper you go, and the stronger the characters become overall. For example, when it comes to transcendent beings, their spirit energy, their very presence, can't be felt by regular two-dimensional characters, no matter how strong they are. The transcendent beings are literally on a different plane of power. Meanwhile, other, oftentimes godly characters, like Ichibei, Yhwach, or even the Soul King himself, find their strength to be defined and depicted by their ability to shape the very world around them. Things start to get a little crazy, that's for sure. And yet, amidst all of this, two characters stand alone in the way their power is depicted, and at least from the outside, they look to be very similar in this regard as well. Of course, I'm talking about the Primera Espada Coyote Stark and the captain of the 11th Division, Kenpachi Zaraki. Two characters who, depending on who you ask, may very well represent the absolute pinnacle of their respective races. And the way their strength is depicted in the series, their unique way, does seem to support this to some degree. You see, unlike every single other character in Bleach, whose power often takes the form of a katana or a sealed weapon of some description, both Stark and Kenpachi's power takes the form of an entirely separate person. Lilinette for Stark, and of course Yachiru for Kenpachi. And yet, how similar actually are these characters when it comes to their power and how it's portrayed in the manga? In today's video, we're going to examine both the parallels and the duality of the strongest, taking a look at how both Stark and Kenpachi's power is brought to life in the story, and what the similarities are between the two, if any, and what they mean. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more from the channel just like this, or you just want to help support the channel, help it to continue to grow, then consider hitting subscribe down below now, as it really does help out. And also consider checking out my other channel as well, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, where your support over there is greatly appreciated too. But without further ado, let's dive into the video itself. So, how does their respective power work in order to manifest in such a way, and what makes it notable? Well, let's look at the Primera Espada Coyote Stark first, as his was the first example of this kind of power being introduced in the series. Technically, Yachiru was around for considerably longer, but up until the 1000-Year Blood War arc, we had no reason to suspect that she was anything other than a regular vice captain. When a hollow becomes an Arankar, they acquire the power of a Shinigami in the form of a Zanpakuto, and in doing so, transform from their original hollow appearance to something considerably more human in nature. What happens to that original hollow appearance, that original hollow power? It is condensed and sealed away in the form of their Zanpakuto. An Arankar's Zanpakuto functions completely differently to a Shinigami's, in that all an Arankar's Zanpakuto is a blade that seals their true latent hollow form and power. Their Zanpakuto has no soul, no unique power or nature of its own. As far as we're aware, it has no shared relationship with the Arankar in question like a Shinigami Zanpakuto would to its wielder. It's just a means for the hollow to seal away the core of their abilities within a manageable form. The Primera Espada Coyote Stark is the only Arankar that's different. Even other monstrously powerful Espada, like Ulquiorra, Yami, and Barragan, seal their true hollow forms away in a weapon, an orthodox method of doing so, but not Stark. Although Stark has what appears to be a Zanpakuto, in actuality it is just a sword, an empty blade, as evidenced by the fact that he sheaths it when preparing to release his power, in a move that surprises Ukitake because it's so out of the norm. In reality, Stark's true power, the true form of his power, takes the form of his fraction Lilynette Gingerback, who is in reality his other half in a sense. She is a fully autonomous character in her own right, and yes, one who can even conjure a weapon of her own. Although by herself, Lilynette is comically weak, especially in comparison to a veteran captain like Ukitake, you don't need me to tell you that power taking the form of an entire, fleshed out, free-thinking, three-dimensional Arankar all by herself implies a considerably greater, denser level and amount of power than can be represented in just a weapon, a sword or otherwise. The origin of this is interesting too. While many of the Arankar we see as part of Aizen's army were artificially created as a result of the Hogyoku, some of them were natural born, including Stark and Lilynette. Although neither of them remembers their original form, we see them in the direct aftermath of their split, and knowing what we do of how their power works, it seems likely their original form, at least in my opinion, was more akin in appearance to Los Lobos, and Lilynette herself is a manifestation of their power given life, though clearly not all of their power, as Stark himself is an incredibly skilled combatant even prior to releasing. Interestingly, the anime gives Lilynette far more agency when in Los Lobos than in the manga, leading me to believe Kubo's original intent for the depiction of their power is that Stark is absolutely the one in control, the Nexus, while Lilynette represents a sizable portion of his latent hollow strength. But yes, Stark's true hollow power takes the form of an entirely separate sentient Arankar, completely unlike the various weapons of every other Arankar. And then there's Kenpachi Zaraki and his vice captain Yachiru Kusajishi. Kenpachi has always been one of the series' most enduringly powerful characters, even if his strength and the perception of it has fluctuated greatly throughout the story. From barely managing to scrape a draw with Ichigo in the Soul Society arc, to killing the 5th Espada in Waco Mundo, and then duking it out with the Zero Espada like it was nothing, to later killing 3 Sternritter with ease, only to then be beaten into a bloody pulp by another one, Kenpachi's own power had long felt uneven, until Kubo decided to get it all in order and do something about it. With the advent of Kenpachi's battle against Unohana after the first Quincy invasion in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, the methodology behind Kenpachi's up and down inconsistent strength at last became clear. Long ago, he'd subconsciously locked down his own power, and since then, each time he was on the brink of death, more and more of that power would be freed up again. Thanks to that, everything seemed to make sense at last, and Kenpachi's power was clear. All of that changed again, though, once Kenpachi battled Gremmy in the second invasion, and at long last released his Zanpakuto, perhaps one of the most anticipated possible moments of the entire series. In the wake of Gremmy's defeat, however, Kenpachi discovered that not only was Yachiru suddenly missing, but she'd in fact left all of her clothes behind, the entirety of her uniform, including her vice captain's badge that was still tied around the sleeve of her Shihakusho, implying that her spiritual body had completely vanished, leaving no trace behind of her earthly form. Everything that was inorganic remained on the battlefield, i.e. her clothes. It's almost akin to what happened to the Shinigami whose Konpaku were forcibly broken down by Aizen's holification experiments in Turn Back the Pendulum, when nothing was found of them but their uniforms in the aftermath. Almost immediately, everyone came to the same conclusion. Yachiru was the spirit of Kenpachi's Zanpakuto, no Zarashi all along, and now that he could finally hear its name and call out its true form, there was either no reason for Yachiru to remain with him in a corporeal form, Or perhaps more likely, she physically couldn't, instead belonging in Kenpachi's inner world, unless he forcibly materialized her. Up until the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Yachiru was thought of as a normal Shinigami. An odd pairing for Kenpachi, sure, but that seemed to be the point, that juxtaposition between their characters. Although only a small child, Yachiru herself had a bloodthirsty love of battle, and enjoyed watching Kenpachi in action, having been by his side ever since he seemingly rescued her from the dark, lawless depravity of the furthest reaches of the Rukongai. Kenpachi having no name of his own, and that being his greatest pain, really, named Yachiru after the only person he had ever admired. Yachiru Unohana, the first captain of the 11th Division and the creator of the blood-soaked title of Kenpachi. It is a little weird that Yachiru only disappears once Kenpachi releases Nozarashi in the battle against Gremi. You'd think that she would have vanished when he, presumably, unlocked Shikai in Muken following the battle with Unohana, though I guess it's possible that upon learning the name of his Zanpakuto, Kenpachi waited until now to release it, maybe for the utmost dramatic effect. He is a showman after all, though I find that slightly hard to believe. However, there is an additional wrinkle to this story. Yachiru isn't Nozarashi's Zanpakuto spirit specifically, but the spirit of Nozarashi's bankai, to be precise. Although Yachiru appears before Kenpachi during his battle with Gerard, and gives him the power of bankai, she simply hands it to him, something that has always really worked for me because unknowingly Kenpachi had forged an incredible bond with his Zanpakuto, materialized in the real world over the years, only she could never act as his Zanpakuto because he couldn't hear its name. We still construed that, her handing him bankai, as her simply being Nozarashi's catch-all Zanpakuto spirit. However, Kubo would eventually clarify the truth in an answer on Club Outside, that Yachiru as we knew her was just the spirit of Kenpachi's bankai that had materialized after separating from the main body. Now, as far as I'm aware, we don't know how or why Yachiru split from Nozarashi. Perhaps Kenpachi's raw power forcibly materialized her, in the same way all Shinigami who want to learn Bankai need to materialize their Zanpakuto spirits. Or maybe it was all a ploy by Nozarashi. Aware that Kenpachi wasn't listening to it, wasn't hearing its name, it somehow tore off a piece of itself, manifested it in the real world, and hoped to forge a connection with Kenpachi that way. We know that Zanpakuto spirits can manifest themselves, should they so choose. I mean, after all, we see Renji speaking with Zabimaru while Renji is hospitalized. You know, as far as I'm concerned, that's not in Renji's inner world. Zabimaru is actually there, trying to get him to kind of, get up and out of bed to face Zangetsu again. But Kubo likened Nozarashi's main form and Yachiru to Old Man Zangetsu and Tensa Zangetsu respectively, which I guess makes sense if you are just trying to visualize what he means. But on a conceptual level, I think it's a bit odd to compare them to what ultimately turned out to be a Quincy power and a deception at that. And so, there you have it, two extremely powerful characters, Starrk and Kenpachi, whose power manifested in the form of a totally separate and sentient being, that as far as we know existed completely on their own. They are the same, but they're also different. In the same way Starrk needs Lilinet to disappear essentially, to merge as one and activate their true power, so too does Yachiru vanish once Kenpachi has unlocked the name of his Zanpakuto. Whether she had any control over this or not, we don't know. Both of these characters have been manifested for a long time, Yachiru especially, I think, and coexisting with their partners in a way that doesn't seem to be detrimental at all. Even without becoming one with their respective other halves, both Starrk and Kenpachi are widely regarded as being some of the strongest characters of the entire series. Ultimately, while we don't necessarily have all the answers, Starrk and Lilinet's dynamic makes perfect sense to me. They were an immeasurably powerful hollow at one point in the past, powerful enough that they could eradicate literally mountains upon mountains of hollows simply by being near them. To escape the loneliness that wrought, they split into two beings, while also becoming natural Arankar at the same time. But I'd argue, based on the form Los Lobos takes, the main body must have been more akin to Starrk, and Lilinet is a portion of his power. Either way, thanks to their immense strength, it was possible for them to become two totally separate sentient beings, something that presumably no other Arankar can do. You know, if we kind of imagine the process of Arankarization, you can imagine the Hollow taking a huge chunk of their true power and forcibly sealing it away into the form of a Zanpakuto, their body then changing to look more humanoid. I know this probably isn't how it happens, but this is a visualization. Whereas Starrk and Lilinet had so much power that when they made that split, when they pulled out some of their power, rather than sealing it away as a sword, it just became Lilinet, presumably. Now, I know in the manga she says to Starrk that you came out of me, implying that she was the original, but considering we've established that they were both one and the same initially, that me that she mentions in that sentence, I mean, it would technically refer to both of them. So what I'm getting at is either of them could have said it and it would have made sense. Anyway, you'd think that at least based on raw Reryoku, this would mean that Starrk has the most of any Espada by far. And I think that's true, at least at a baseline level. You see, the difference between him and Yami is that Yami has the unique ability to store Reryoku and can continuously build upon it until he finally releases his Zanpakuto. Now, we've discussed it before, but Yami seems to have to be in a certain state of readiness to become the Zero Espada, after having spent an inordinate amount of time eating and sleeping, and all the while building Reryoku. And I do kind of wonder what would happen if he released his Zanpakuto without storing any spirit energy beforehand. Anyway, that's a different discussion for a different time. On the other side of the aisle, Kenpachi is definitely the weirder of the two, I think, to fully understand. It is less straightforward, that's for sure. Why did Yachiru materialize? Again, we discussed that a minute ago. Perhaps it was a ploy on Nozarashi's part. Perhaps it was completely random. But also, how did she materialize? And why would only the Bankai spirit come forth? What does that mean for Nozarashi itself? Yachiru has been existing on the outside for potentially hundreds of years at this point, all the while Nozarashi was actively screaming at Kenpachi to listen to its cries. Even though Kenpachi and his Bankai spirit have an inseparable relationship, the same can't really be said for the spirit of Nozarashi Shikai. This is a relationship that's completely new to Kenpachi and needs to be built upon. Does the fact that Kenpachi has that rock-solid relationship with Yachiru help his relationship with Nozarashi itself, even after being deaf to at least the Shikai version for so many years? Maybe it does? After all, Nozarashi and Yachiru should be one and the same, to some degree anyway, and ultimately going even further than that, Nozarashi is Kenpachi. Also, is it more impressive to have a Zanpakuto spirit materialized in this way, or a Hollow's true power? Or are they the same? Interestingly, both Starrk and Kenpachi have kind of siphoned off, intentionally or otherwise, a similar amount of power. And Arankar's Resurrection has been compared to a Shinigami's Bankai before, and that's effectively what each of them has manifested into a living form. There is one other character in the series who is a little like this in some way, but actually goes way beyond this, comically beyond this, to the point where they aren't even comparable, hence why this video isn't about them. And you can probably guess who I'm talking about already, but of course it is Adnias himself, who of course used to be one singular being, But then even after he was carved up, his body parts were so innately powerful that some of them at least gained sentience, and that power they held within them was great enough to be considered a part of Yuha Bark's Schutzstaffel in the future. And of course, the Soul King's left arm became Pernida Pankajaz, a captain-level fighter, a greater, frankly, than captain-level fighter, who is immeasurably powerful and sentient. The Soul King's right arm became Mimihagi, something so strong it was capable of halting the collapsing of the three worlds back into one again. The Soul King's heart, while we don't know if it has sentience itself, I'm more inclined to believe that Gerard is a vessel, akin to the way Ukitake was. In fact, Kubo maybe mentioned that in a club outside, I can't remember. But the Soul King's heart is strong enough, clearly, that it gave Gerard the power that would come to be known as the Miracle, which, as we've seen, is essentially immortality. Life being represented by the heart. The Soul King's heart brings about life, life begets life, where this is concerned. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as a tiny little aside. I don't consider this the same thing exactly. Starrk and Kenpachi are way, way more comparable, hence why this video is about them, but I thought the Soul King would be fun to bring up as well, because in some way he is kind of the same, only on a vastly greater level. Just completely different in that sense, but the core concept of being able to take power from the Soul King and it manifest itself in a sentient being is kind of the same. Although, maybe it's not quite the same because, for example, Pernida is quite literally the Soul King's left arm. But either way, we're going off on a tangent, but I thought it'd be fun to bring up. But also, for all their similarities between Starrk and Kenpachi, this comparison has actively shown as well that these two characters aren't the same, even if they both share in this depiction of power, something that is unique to them. Again, apart from maybe the Soul King, no other character's power in Bleach takes the shape of a sentient being that lives in universe alongside the central character in question. Stark seemed to, at the very least, purposefully separate himself from his power, though it's difficult to know exactly what he knew at the time, though I guess on a meta level, that is technically still true, because he wanted to be weaker, he wanted to actively weaken himself, as did Lilanet with them being one and the same, to avoid them killing their friends by accident. So yeah, in a sense, he is separating himself from his power. Or they are, I guess is more accurate to say. What I mean is, when Stark and Lilanet split, did they do so knowing they would be able to merge again in the future? Did they do so knowing that they would, in essence, act as a typical Arrancar and their Zanpakuto moving forward? Because it seems pretty fortuitous to me. And then there's Kenpachi, for who I think it's pretty obvious the split was a subconscious thing, and he had absolutely no idea of Yachiru's true identity right up until the moment. A better question is, a more pertinent question is, did Yachiru know who or what she really was? There's a part of me that thinks she didn't. Obviously, there's that nice moment when they first meet, where Yachiru reaches out and touches Kenpachi's blade, but ultimately, while it's a cool coincidence, I don't think it was originally meant to mean anything. It was just supposed to show that she was used to the lawless, blood-soaked world around her. Now, though, it works pretty well. Honestly, though, I think that crucial scene at the end of Kenpachi's battle with Ichigo not only gives us a great insight into Kenpachi's relationship with Yachiru, but also pretty resolutely confirms, at least in my opinion, that she doesn't know who she really is. Considering how much she cares for Kenpachi, how real that relationship is, and how she knows it is reciprocated, he does very much care for her too. He saved her life, as she herself notes in the Soul Society arc. I think if she did know who she really was, she wouldn't just sit there and watch as he actively tries to speak to Nozarashi again and is clearly in great pain when it doesn't work, when he continues to be stuck without a name, an agony both of them know too well. Anyway, as we start to wind this discussion down, I'm left wondering, what does it all mean? What does it mean for these two powerhouses specifically? Does the fact their power manifests in this unique way automatically mean they are the strongest of their respective races? The absolute pinnacle of what can be achieved by Shinigami and Hollow while still remaining a single race being, by which I mean neither of them are transcendent. But I mean there's no doubt they exhibit trace elements of what other actually transcendent characters can and have done. For example, Stark and Lillinet's original form mass obliterating Hollows simply by being near them is an incredible and often overlooked feat. It's akin to Aizen being able to erase souls simply by walking by them. It's akin, in a way, to the way those Hollows begin to crack and break down under the sheer weight of the gathered spirit pressure of every single fighter arriving in the fake Karakura town. And to be honest, that's actually an interesting comparison, because they are being crushed, they're being quashed under that weight, but obviously it's not a direct comparison, because the fighters, the Gote 13 and Aizen and his army, are potentially miles and miles into the air, as opposed to being right next to them. But I think the comparison is an interesting one. And so Stark and Lillinet's original form was exhibiting that same kind of crushing power up close and personal. Very interesting, I think. And of course, Kenpachi is famously Kenpachi, even back in the Soul Society arc when he was at the weakest we've ever known him. Ichigo couldn't even cut him to begin with. But ultimately, it's difficult to quantify whether the existence of Lilinet and Yachiru really serves to make these two characters that much stronger. In a sense, I feel like it has to, but I also don't think it's that simple either. What it likely does mean, however, is that both of these characters have an insurmountable amount of spirit energy, maybe more than any other character of their race. Though I do also need to bring up that nowhere is it said that no other character can actually do this. For example, what's to say Aizen couldn't somehow separate a portion of his Zanpakuto spirit and have it live and materialize in the world around him? There's nothing to say that isn't possible, especially since he is most famous for his sheer amount of spirit energy. Again, where the Hollows are concerned, things get a little muddy thanks to Yami, but again, as I explained earlier, I don't think he has more Reryoku than Stark initially at all times, but I do think he has the capacity to gather and store more, allowing for his transformation to the Zero Espada. Either way, the parallels between these two characters are really cool, and in a way, it's a shame they never met properly, outside of Stark vanishing from in front of Kenpachi in the blink of an eye anyway. Their personalities couldn't be more different, of course. Kenpachi loves to fight, whereas Stark tries to avoid it at all costs, and was even more willing to do so than Kyoraku when push came to shove. But at the same time, it does feel like they both bear the burden of being the strongest of their respective sides in some form at least. While they do both share this unique trait of having siphoned off a portion of their power and it having taken the form of a genuine sentient being, and that means they together do stand alone among the rest of the Bleach cast, ultimately we can see that they are not exactly the same. The ways in which Lilinet and Yachiru came into being are seemingly different, and there is a seeming level of agency involved there, and they both represent something different in each other too. In the relationships they have with Stark and Kenpachi respectively, and how they are both integrated back into the wider whole. I guess the final question is, are Stark and Kenpachi supposed to be comparable in this way? Was this an intentional, conscious move by Kubo? Especially considering for a very long time, Stark was completely unique in this regard, up until halfway through the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Or is it just a coincidence? If it was intentional, what is it supposed to represent for these two characters? That they are indeed the strongest? And that it's lonely at the top, wherein both characters know and understand the pain of not having something that everyone else has, be that friends or a name. I'd love to know your thoughts on the discussion too, so of course, as always, do let me know down in the comments. Alright, but that's going to do it for this video, guys. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Like I said, let me know your thoughts on this discussion down in the comments. What do you think of the duality of the strongest between Starrk and Kenpachi, Lilanet and Yachiru? Are these similarities intentional? Are they conscious? What do you think of the different ways these two characters came into being, came to be the way they are, and how they resolve themselves in the end? As always, I'd love to hear all of your thoughts, so do please let me know. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for watching. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already for more Bleach content like this every single week. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up as well, that helps massively, and consider checking out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, and consider showing your support over there as well. That would really mean a lot. As always, a massive, unending thank you goes out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to keep doing this. Your support does mean absolutely everything to me, and it does make an enormous difference, so thank you all so very much. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.